Some people believe fate arrives with flowers. Mine walked into a crowded restaurant wearing a black tailored coat and the reputation of the most feared alpha in the city. The first thing I noticed wasn't his face. It was the silence that followed him. Conversation softened without anyone realizing it, waiters instinctively stepped aside, and every alpha in the room straightened as though an invisible line had been drawn across the floor. I had no idea who he was. To me, he was simply another stranger arriving 10 minutes late to someone else's disaster. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I wasn't even supposed to be there that afternoon. My roommate had begged me to fill in for his cousin after a last-minute emergency ruined a carefully arranged blind date. Just sit there until he shows up, he'd laughed. Explain the situation, apologize, and leave. It sounded harmless enough. I worked from home as a freelance illustrator, deadlines followed me everywhere, and I figured wasting 30 minutes over coffee wasn't the end of the world. Outside, steady spring rain painted silver lines across the windows while the scent of fresh espresso drifted through the cafe. It should have been an ordinary Saturday. Instead, it became the day everything changed. Across the room, the restaurant doors opened again. The man everyone seemed to recognize stepped inside without rushing, his calm presence somehow commanding more attention than anyone speaking loudly ever could. Dark hair, composed expression, sharp grey eyes that seemed to study every corner before resting on a table near the windows. I noticed another man waving enthusiastically from that table, clearly expecting him. They must have been friends. I looked away, reaching for my coffee, already rehearsing the awkward apology I would give once the actual blind date arrived. I never got the chance. Before I could stand, I felt it. Not fear. Not excitement. Just the strange certainty that someone was looking directly at me. I raised my eyes and met his. The restaurant disappeared. The laughter faded into distant echoes. Even the rain beyond the glass seemed to pause. His expression didn't change, but something in those steel-colored eyes sharpened with unmistakable focus, as though he had entered the building searching for one person and somehow found someone entirely unexpected. He barely acknowledged the friend who had called him over. Instead, his attention lingered on me for one heartbeat, then another. Confused, I glanced behind me to see if someone else had caught his attention. There was no one. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from my roommate flashed across the screen. Don't wait. The date's cancelled. Head home. Relief washed over me. I smiled to myself, gathered my sketchbook, and slipped my jacket over my shoulders. As I walked past the stranger, I offered the polite smile Americans exchange with people they'll probably never meet again. He didn't return it. He simply watched me leave, his unreadable gaze following every step until the restaurant door closed behind me. I never learned that afternoon that the man I had unknowingly walked past was Damian Moretti, the alpha who ruled one of the city's most powerful criminal organizations. And Damian never expected that the Omega who wasn't supposed to be at that blind date would become the one person capable of changing the course of his carefully controlled life. The rain had not stopped by the time I reached my apartment. Water drummed softly against the fire escape outside my living room window while the scent of fresh coffee still lingered on my jacket from the restaurant. I tossed my sketchbook onto the couch and tried to focus on the illustration waiting on my laptop, but every few minutes my pencil froze above the screen. Those grey eyes kept finding their way back into my thoughts. It made no sense. I had exchanged nothing more than a polite smile with a stranger. Yet something about the way he had looked at me felt unfinished, like a conversation interrupted before either person had spoken. Across the city, Damian Moretti remained seated long after his friend Adrian finished explaining why the blind date had fallen apart. Adrian leaned back with a relieved sigh and laughed. At least my parents cannot blame me this time. The Omega never even showed up. Damian slowly turned his attention away from the restaurant entrance. He was there. Adrian frowned. Who? The Omega sitting by the window. Adrian blinked in confusion before shaking his head. No. That was not him. The person I was supposed to meet cancelled almost an hour before I arrived. I was waiting for the restaurant manager to confirm it. Damien's expression remained calm, but the answer settled strangely in his mind. If that Omega had not been Adrian's date, then why had he been sitting there alone with obvious uncertainty written across his face? More importantly, why had Damien noticed him before anyone else in the room? He had walked into hostile negotiations without his heartbeat changing. He had spent years making impossible decisions without hesitation. Yet one brief glance from a complete stranger refused to leave him alone. Adrian continued talking about family expectations, business obligations, and the relief of escaping another arranged introduction, but Damien barely heard a word. Instead, he replayed the small details. The oversized sweater. The sketchbook resting beside a half-finished cup of coffee. The polite smile that carried no fear, no ambition, and no attempt to impress him. It was genuine. He could not remember the last time someone had looked at him without already knowing his name. Later that evening, Damien stood alone inside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse overlooking the city lights. His longtime advisor, Christopher Hale, quietly entered the room carrying a tablet. "The board meeting has been moved to Tuesday," Christopher said. Damien nodded without turning around. After several seconds of silence, he finally asked a question that caught Christopher completely off guard. "Find someone for me." Christopher raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "A young Omega. Brown hair. About 22. He was carrying a weathered sketchbook with blue paint stains along the edge." Christopher waited, expecting more details. "Do you know his name?" Damien answered honestly. "No." "Occupation?" "No." "Address?" "No." Christopher almost smiled. It was the first time in years that Damien Moretti had requested information with so little certainty. That is not much to work with. Damien's eyes remained fixed on the city below. He left the restaurant at exactly 3:23 this afternoon. Start there. Meanwhile, I finally gave up trying to work and walked downstairs to the neighborhood grocery store for milk and bread before it closed. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harper, spotted me comparing cereal boxes and smiled warmly. "Working too hard again, Ethan?" I laughed. Deadlines never seemed to take weekends off. She handed me a loaf of fresh bread. "Then make sure you remember to eat." Moments like that reminded me why I loved my neighborhood. It was ordinary in the best possible way. Nobody cared about status. Nobody measured people by money or influence. As I stepped outside with my grocery bag, I never noticed the dark luxury sedan parked quietly across the street. Inside, a driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir," he said softly into the hands-free system, "we found him." The black sedan remained across the street for less than 2 minutes before quietly disappearing into evening traffic, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. I walked home carrying nothing more exciting than groceries and a head full of unfinished illustrations, completely unaware that someone had already begun asking questions about my life. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the familiar rhythm of my neighborhood. I unlocked the small studio where I worked, opened the front windows to let the cool spring air drift inside, and settled into another long day of drawing book covers for an independent publisher in Seattle. My clients rarely cared where I lived as long as deadlines were met. That simple routine suited me perfectly. Across town, Christopher Hale stood inside Damien Moretti's private office holding a slim folder that looked almost empty. "His name is Ethan Brooks," Christopher began. 22 years old. Freelance illustrator. Lives alone in a modest apartment on Maple Street. No criminal record. No unusual financial activity. Volunteers twice a month teaching art classes at the community center. Visits the same neighborhood grocery store every Sunday evening. Drinks black coffee with a little honey. He has no known connection to organized crime, political families, or any business that would interest us. Damien accepted the folder without opening it. Family. Both parents passed away several years ago. No siblings. A few close friends. Quiet life. Christopher studied Damien carefully before asking the question that had been lingering since yesterday. What exactly are you looking for? Damien looked toward the city skyline beyond the glass walls. I do not know. Christopher almost laughed before stopping himself. During the 15 years he had worked beside Damien, every decision had been precise, calculated, and supported by facts. This was different. Would you like surveillance to continue? Christopher asked. Damien answered after a long silence. No. Christopher looked genuinely surprised. Then this ends here. Damien closed the folder and placed it on the polished desk. No unnecessary interference. If his life remains peaceful, we stay out of it. Christopher nodded, although he sensed that Damien had already broken one of his own rules. The folder remained on the desk long after the meeting ended. Damien told himself he had satisfied his curiosity. Ethan Brooks was exactly what he appeared to be. Ordinary. Honest. Unremarkable by every measurable standard. Yet that conclusion somehow made the questions even louder. Why had fate crossed their paths in such an unlikely way? Why had Ethan been sitting in a chair meant for someone else? Why did the memory of one quiet smile refuse to fade? Meanwhile, my own week passed without anything unusual happening. I spent mornings sketching, afternoons meeting clients through video calls, and evenings walking to Riverside Park whenever my eyes became tired from staring at a screen. On Thursday, the community center hosted its weekly children's art class. Watching 6-year-olds proudly show off colorful drawings of impossible dragons and smiling astronauts always reminded me that creativity did not have to be perfect to matter. Mr. Ethan, one little girl asked while holding up a picture covered in glitter, do you think dragons like rainbows? I smiled. I think dragons probably wish people believed in them a little more. The room filled with laughter. Moments like these grounded me in a life I never wanted to exchange for anything more complicated. As class ended, I stepped outside carrying a cardboard box filled with paintbrushes. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly through the intersection before stopping at the red light. The rear passenger window was tinted too dark to see inside, but for one brief second I felt the unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me again. I looked up instinctively. The traffic light turned green. The vehicle continued forward without stopping. By the time it disappeared around the corner, I had already convinced myself it was nothing more than imagination. Inside the moving SUV, Damien quietly watched the community center vanish behind them. He had instructed his driver to take a different route home. That explanation sounded reasonable enough, even to himself. Yet as the city faded into the distance, he realized something he had not expected. Seeing Ethan again had not answered any of his questions. It had only made leaving feel unexpectedly difficult. Friday afternoon usually meant crowded sidewalks, food trucks lining the downtown plaza, and people hurrying into the weekend with relieved smiles. I finished delivering the final illustrations for my latest project and decided to celebrate by treating myself to a cup of coffee from a small cafe near the river. It had become my favorite place to sketch because nobody there seemed interested in anything except good pastries and quiet conversations. I settled near the window, opened my notebook, and began drawing strangers passing outside. An elderly couple holding hands. A teenager walking an oversized golden retriever. A father carrying a sleepy little girl on his shoulders. Ordinary moments always inspired me more than dramatic ones. Across the city, Christopher entered Damien's office without knocking, something he only did when the matter could not wait. There is a situation, he said calmly. Damien looked up from the financial reports covering his desk. Explain. Christopher placed another folder in front of him. 3 different groups have independently requested information about Ethan Brooks during the past 48 hours. Damien's expression remained unreadable. Who? None of them know much. That is what concerns me. One inquiry came through a private investigator. Another through a corporate security consultant. The third used anonymous channels. Damien slowly closed the report he had been reading. Why would anyone care about an illustrator? Christopher answered honestly. We do not know. Silence settled across the office. Damien had spent years surviving because he never ignored unusual patterns. One inquiry could be coincidence. 3 almost never were. Continue observing, Damien finally said. Discreetly. Christopher nodded. Do you want us to approach him? No. Warn him? Damien looked toward the window. Not until we understand what we are looking at. Christopher left the office knowing that Damien's instructions had become increasingly difficult to separate from personal concern. Meanwhile, I remained completely unaware that my quiet life had somehow become the subject of conversations happening in places I would never imagine. The only challenge occupying my mind that afternoon was deciding whether my latest sketch needed more color. As I reached for my coffee, someone accidentally bumped into my table. I am so sorry, a young woman said while catching the edge of my notebook before it slipped onto the floor. That was completely my fault. I smiled. No damage done. She glanced down at the open page filled with pencil drawings. Did you draw these? I nodded. Mostly while people are not paying attention. She laughed softly. That sounds like a wonderful way to remember the world. We exchanged a few friendly words before she returned to meet her friends. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but several tables away a man quietly lowered his newspaper after watching the entire interaction. A tiny wireless earpiece rested beneath his dark hair. Without attracting attention, he spoke in a low voice. Subject remains alone. No unusual activity. Several miles away, Christopher listened to the update before ending the call. He disliked assigning people to watch someone as harmless as Ethan, yet recent events no longer felt accidental. Back inside the cafe, I packed my notebook as rain clouds gathered once again over the river. By the time I stepped outside, the first drops had already begun falling. I pulled up my hood and started walking toward the subway station. Halfway across the next intersection, a delivery cyclist rounded the corner faster than expected. Startled, I stepped backward to avoid the bicycle just as another pedestrian reached out and gently steadied my arm. Careful, an older gentleman said with a kind smile. These streets become slippery when it rains. Thank you, I replied, slightly embarrassed. He tipped his hat and continued walking without another word. The entire moment lasted only seconds, but from a parked vehicle across the street Damien watched it unfold through rain-speckled glass. Relief settled quietly in his chest before he could stop himself. He frowned almost immediately. Relief was not an emotion he welcomed easily, especially for someone who still believed he was only observing the life of a stranger. Yet as Ethan disappeared into the growing crowd beneath a sea of umbrellas, Damien realized that protecting the distance between them was becoming far more difficult than closing it. The weekend arrived with unexpected sunshine, washing away days of grey skies and filling the city with an easy warmth that invited everyone outdoors. I decided to spend Saturday morning at the Riverside Artisan Market, hoping a change of scenery might inspire my next illustration series. Small white tents stretched along the waterfront, displaying handmade pottery, watercolor paintings, fresh flowers, and shelves filled with old books that carried the comforting scent of worn paper. Children laughed as musicians played acoustic guitars near the fountain, and for the first time all week, I forgot about the strange feeling that someone had been watching me. A quiet life had a way of healing itself when surrounded by ordinary happiness. Several blocks away, a black sedan rolled slowly through downtown traffic before stopping near the market entrance. Christopher glanced toward Damien from the driver's seat. "We can still leave," he said carefully. Damien rested one hand on the closed folder lying beside him. "We are already here." Christopher gave a faint nod. "You told me once that unnecessary attachment creates unnecessary risk." Damien answered without looking away from the crowd gathering outside. "I remember." "Then why are we here?" For several long seconds, Damien remained silent. Finally he admitted something he had not been willing to say aloud before. "Because I want to know if he smiles the same way when nobody is looking." Christopher said nothing after that. Some questions did not require further discussion. Damien stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a simple charcoal jacket instead of the tailored suits that usually announced his status long before he spoke. Without bodyguards surrounding him or business associates walking at his side, he blended into the weekend crowd more easily than anyone would have expected. Meanwhile, I wandered from booth to booth searching for inspiration. A local painter demonstrated watercolor techniques to curious visitors while a retired woodworker carved tiny birds from pieces of maple. Every conversation felt genuine, every smile unforced. I paused beside a stand displaying handcrafted journals, running my fingers across the textured leather covers. "Beautiful workmanship," I murmured. "They are," another voice agreed beside me. I turned instinctively and froze for half a heartbeat. The stranger from the restaurant stood only a few feet away, holding one of the journals with calm familiarity. Up close, his grey eyes seemed softer than I remembered, though there was still something quietly guarded about them. He offered a polite smile this time. "We keep meeting in unexpected places." I laughed awkwardly. I was thinking exactly the same thing. For a moment neither of us seemed to know what came next. The silence was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar, like two people standing on the edge of a conversation neither had planned to have. I extended my hand first. "I am Ethan." He accepted the handshake with calm confidence. "Damien." His grip was steady, respectful, and brief. Nothing about the exchange suggested the weight his name carried elsewhere. In the city. To me, he was simply another visitor enjoying a Saturday morning. We drifted naturally toward the next booth where a local photographer displayed landscapes from national parks across the country. "Do you travel often?" I asked. Damien studied a photograph of mountain peaks glowing beneath sunrise. "Not as much as I would like." "Same here," I admitted. "Most of my adventures happen through sketchbooks." His eyes shifted toward me with quiet curiosity. "You draw?" "Illustrations, mostly." "Books?" "Sometimes children ask for dragons." A genuine smile reached his face before disappearing almost as quickly as it appeared. "Then I hope they always receive dragons." The simple reply caught me off guard. There was warmth hidden beneath his reserved nature, the kind people rarely noticed unless they slowed down enough to look for it. Neither of us realized we had already spent nearly 30 minutes walking through the market together. Across the plaza, Christopher watched discreetly from a nearby coffee stand before quietly lowering his phone without sending the update he had been preparing. For the first time since this strange chain of coincidences had begun, Damien was no longer observing Ethan from a distance. He was standing beside him, speaking with him, and looking unexpectedly at peace. Christopher had worked with Damien long enough to recognize the change, and it left him with one unsettling realization. This was no longer curiosity. It had quietly become something neither of them could easily turn away from. By the time the afternoon sun began slipping behind the skyline, the market had grown quieter. Vendors packed away handcrafted treasures while families wandered toward the river for evening concerts. Damien and I found ourselves sitting on a wooden bench overlooking the water, each holding a paper cup of freshly squeezed lemonade purchased from a nearby stand. The conversation came surprisingly easily. We talked about favorite books, hidden hiking trails, childhood dreams, and the strange comfort of rainy afternoons. There were moments when neither of us spoke at all, yet the silence never felt awkward. It simply settled around us like an old friendship that had somehow arrived years ahead of schedule. "You notice small things," Damien observed after watching me sketch a family feeding ducks across the riverbank. I smiled without looking up from the page. "Details tell better stories than dramatic moments." He considered that quietly. Most people spend their lives chasing dramatic moments. Maybe that is why they miss the stories happening every day. For the first time in years, Damien found himself wishing an ordinary afternoon would last a little longer. His phone vibrated once inside his jacket pocket. He ignored it. A second notification followed only seconds later. He ignored that one too. Christopher, standing several yards away beneath the shade of an old oak tree, immediately understood what that meant. Damien never ignored business calls unless something had fundamentally shifted inside him. Finally, after nearly a minute, Damien glanced at the screen. Christopher's message was unusually brief. "We need to leave." Another inquiry about Ethan. Damien's expression remained calm, but the warmth in his eyes faded almost imperceptibly. I noticed the change. "Everything okay?" I asked. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Work has a habit of arriving at inconvenient times." I laughed. "I understand that better than you think." He looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you?" Clients have a remarkable talent for discovering emergencies 5 minutes before weekends begin. That earned another genuine smile from him, one that appeared more naturally this time. We stood together and slowly walked toward the parking area where our paths would separate. "It was nice meeting you properly," I said. "Maybe the third coincidence will not take as long." Damien replied before he could stop himself. "I hope it does not." The word surprised both of us. For a brief second we simply looked at one another, neither willing to explain why such a simple sentence suddenly carried unexpected meaning. We exchanged phone numbers almost casually, promising nothing beyond staying in touch. To me, it felt like meeting someone interesting whose company I genuinely enjoyed. To Damien, it felt dangerously close to opening a door he had spent years making certain remained locked. As I walked toward the subway station, I turned once and waved. Damien returned the gesture, remaining exactly where he stood until I disappeared into the evening crowd. Only then did Christopher approach. "The report became clearer," he said quietly. Damien's attention shifted back to the world he knew too well. "Explain." "The anonymous inquiries are connected to a financial investigation involving several shell companies. Someone believes an unidentified witness attended a private meeting at the restaurant last week. Ethan was photographed inside the building at almost the exact time." Damien immediately understood the misunderstanding. Ethan had simply been sitting in the wrong chair at the wrong time. He had seen nothing, known nothing, and yet coincidence had quietly placed him inside someone else's investigation. "Does anyone know who he really is?" Damien asked. Christopher shook his head. "Not yet. They only know an unidentified Omega was present." Damien looked toward the subway entrance where Ethan had vanished moments earlier. A decision formed without calculation, something that rarely happened in his carefully ordered life. "Increase observation," he said calmly. "No contact unless absolutely necessary. No interference with his daily routine. If any situation begins moving toward him, I want to know before it reaches his door." Christopher studied him for a long moment. "You are protecting him now." Damien did not answer immediately because denying it would have been dishonest. As the last light of sunset reflected across the river, he quietly admitted the truth to himself before speaking a single sentence. "I told myself I wanted to keep him out of my world. I am beginning to realize that my world has already started moving toward him." Monday morning arrived with the comfortable rhythm I had always trusted. The neighborhood coffee shop greeted regular customers by name, bicycles lined the sidewalks outside the bakery, and the scent of fresh bread drifted through Maple Street as if nothing in the world had changed. I answered client emails, finalized another illustration, and accepted a last-minute request to create artwork for a children's reading festival scheduled the following month. My biggest concern was whether the colors in a forest scene felt warm enough for young readers. I had no idea that somewhere else in the city, conversations about me had become increasingly serious. Damien stood in the private conference room overlooking the downtown skyline while Christopher projected several maps onto a large screen. Colored markers highlighted locations that meant nothing to anyone outside their organization. "The pattern is becoming clearer," Christopher explained. "The people searching for the unidentified Omega have narrowed the timeline. They know the individual left the restaurant before 4 o'clock. They also know he carried a sketchbook." Damien folded his arms quietly. "Do they know his identity?" "No. But they have begun checking nearby businesses for security footage from that afternoon." Another advisor entered carrying additional reports. Most of the recordings have already been deleted because of normal storage limits, but a few cameras still exist. Damien listened without interrupting. Every new detail confirmed the same conclusion. Ethan had accidentally stepped into the edge of a situation he did not understand, and now complete strangers were trying to identify him for reasons that remained unclear. Christopher finally broke the silence. There is still an easy solution. Damien looked toward him. Which is? Tell Ethan enough of the truth that he becomes more careful without revealing who you really are. Damien immediately dismissed the suggestion. He deserves an ordinary life, not constant suspicion. Christopher lowered his voice. He may not have that choice much longer. Those words remained with Damien long after the meeting ended. Later that afternoon my phone vibrated while I organized paint supplies inside the community center. A new message appeared on the screen. Damien. I hope I am not interrupting your work. I smiled before replying. Not at all. I am teaching art class today. How about you? The response came only moments later. Meetings. Too many of them. I laughed softly to myself. Somehow that sounded exactly like him. During the next several days, our conversations became an unexpected part of my routine. We exchanged photographs of coffee shops, recommended novels neither of us had finished reading, and debated whether autumn or spring offered better colors for artists. He never spoke much about his work, and I never pushed him. Everyone deserved parts of life they chose to keep private. What mattered was how easy everything else felt. On Thursday evening, Damien surprised himself by accepting my invitation to visit the community center after class. He arrived wearing another simple jacket that made him look less like an executive and more like an ordinary professional finishing a long day at work. The children immediately surrounded him with cheerful curiosity. One little boy proudly held up a paper rocket covered in bright blue stars. Mr. Damien, he announced, mine is going all the way to Mars. Damien accepted the drawing with complete seriousness. Then I hope you remember us when you get there. The room erupted with laughter. Watching him kneel beside children discussing crayons and planets felt strangely unreal. The quiet man I had met at the market seemed genuinely comfortable here, smiling more often than I had ever seen before. As class ended, Mrs. Harper, my elderly neighbor, happened to stop by the center with homemade cookies for the volunteers. She looked from me to Damien with unmistakable amusement. So this is the friend you have been smiling at your phone about. My face immediately grew warm. Mrs. Harper. She simply laughed and handed Damien a small paper bag. Anyone who makes Ethan laugh this much deserves fresh oatmeal cookies. Damien accepted them politely. Thank you. Walking home together beneath the glow of streetlights, neither of us mentioned her comment, but the silence between us had changed again. It no longer belonged to strangers learning about each other. It belonged to two people quietly wondering whether coincidence had already become something much more difficult to name. Across the street, hidden inside a parked vehicle, a camera lens lowered after capturing a single clear photograph of Ethan and Damien. Walking side by side, and somewhere beyond the quiet neighborhood, someone finally whispered the words they had been searching for all week. We found the Omega. The photograph reached Christopher before sunrise. He stared at the image for several long seconds before quietly placing it on Damien's desk. Ethan stood beneath the warm glow of a street lamp, smiling as he listened to something Damien had said. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary evening between two new friends. To someone searching for the unidentified Omega from the restaurant, it was the missing piece of a puzzle. Damien studied the photograph without touching it. How many people have seen this? Christopher answered honestly. Too many. The room fell silent. Damien had spent years preventing small problems from becoming larger ones through careful planning, but this situation had never followed logic. Ethan had done nothing wrong. His only mistake had been sitting in the wrong chair on the wrong afternoon and then meeting the wrong Alpha. Christopher finally spoke again. You cannot keep both worlds separated forever. Damien closed his eyes briefly before standing. No. I cannot. At that same moment, my Thursday morning began exactly as every other one had. I stopped by the neighborhood bakery, greeted Mrs. Harper while she watered flowers outside her apartment building, and walked toward the community center carrying a portfolio filled with sketches for the Children's Reading Festival. Halfway there my phone vibrated. Damien. Are you free for dinner tonight? I smiled before answering. I should finish work around 6. There is a small Italian restaurant near the river that makes incredible homemade pasta. A reply appeared almost immediately. I will be there. The simple exchange somehow made the rest of my day pass faster than usual. By early evening I arrived at the restaurant first and chose a table near the windows overlooking the water. Soft music drifted through the dining room while candles flickered against polished glass. Damien arrived only a few minutes later wearing another understated jacket that made him look like any other professional ending a busy workday. He apologized for being late even though he was not. We ordered dinner, shared fresh bread, and talked about everything except work. I told him about the little girl who still believed dragons preferred rainbow-colored wings. He admitted he had secretly searched online for children's books after visiting the community center because he wanted to understand why the students loved drawing imaginary creatures so much. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, I realized I had completely forgotten that we had only known each other for a short time. It felt as though life had quietly placed someone familiar back into my path instead of introducing someone new. Damien watched me smile across the table and understood something that could no longer be ignored. The peaceful future he wanted for Ethan could never exist while the truth remained hidden between them. After dinner we walked slowly along the river as city lights shimmered across the water. A cool breeze carried the scent of spring flowers through the park. I noticed Damien unusually quiet. You have been thinking about something all evening, I said gently. He looked out across the river before answering. Ethan, there is something about me you deserve to know. I waited patiently. I own several companies, he began carefully. Some of my work involves people and situations that attract more attention than I would prefer. I smiled reassuringly. Everyone has responsibilities. He shook his head slightly. Mine are more complicated than most. Before I could respond, Christopher approached from the opposite sidewalk. His expression remained calm, but I immediately sensed the urgency in his eyes. I am sorry to interrupt, he said politely. Damien, there is an issue that requires your attention. Damien did not move. Can it wait? Christopher glanced briefly toward me before answering with unusual firmness. No. It cannot. For the first time since we met, I watched Damien's calm composure fracture almost invisibly. He looked at me with unmistakable reluctance. I have to go. I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. Of course. He hesitated as though wanting to say much more, but no words came. Instead he quietly reached into his pocket and handed me a small leather notebook. Keep this until I see you again. Confused, I accepted it. What is it? He offered a faint smile filled with emotions I could not quite understand. Something that will explain why I should have told you the truth much sooner. As Damien and Christopher disappeared into the waiting car, I stood alone beside the river holding the notebook in my hands, completely unaware that opening its first page would change everything I believed I knew about the man who had unexpectedly walked into my life. My hands trembled as I opened the small leather notebook beneath the glow of a nearby street lamp. The first page contained only a single sentence written in neat handwriting. If you are reading this, then I have already failed to tell you the truth face to face. Beneath those words rested a simple business card. Damien Moretti, Chief Executive Officer, Moretti Holdings. I frowned. The name sounded familiar, though I could not immediately remember why. Turning the next page, I found another handwritten note. I never wanted you to discover who I am through rumors instead of through me. I closed the notebook slowly, unsure why such an ordinary confession carried so much weight. When I returned home, curiosity finally overcame exhaustion. I searched his name online. Hundreds of articles appeared within seconds. International investments. Luxury hotels. Technology companies. Philanthropic foundations. Then another headline caught my attention. The elusive Moretti family, long surrounded by speculation because of old organized crime connections, continues transforming its legacy into legitimate global business. I stared silently at the screen. The Damien I knew was kind to children, laughed at dragon drawings, and listened patiently while I described imaginary forests. The internet described someone powerful, distant, and endlessly mysterious. Neither version felt completely wrong. The following morning my phone remained silent. So did the next day. By Sunday afternoon I finally received a message. May we meet one last time? No explanations. No excuses. Just one honest conversation. I replied almost immediately. Yes. We met at the same riverside bench where we had first shared lemonade after the artisan market. Spring flowers swayed gently in the breeze while sailboats drifted quietly across the water. Damien looked more tired than I had ever seen him, though his calm expression remained unchanged. Before he could speak, I held up the notebook. You should have trusted me sooner. He lowered his eyes briefly. I know. We sat together in silence until he finally began telling me everything he safely could. He explained that his family history was complicated, that many assumptions people made about him were rooted in old stories rather than the man he wanted to become, and that certain business responsibilities required constant caution because public attention often attracted unwanted consequences. He never glorified that part of his life. Instead, he spoke with quiet regret about the years he had sacrificed ordinary friendships in exchange for responsibility. When he finished, I asked only one question. When we met at the restaurant, did you already know who I was? He smiled faintly. No. I only knew that someone who was never supposed to be sitting there somehow became impossible to forget. I laughed softly, remembering the cancelled blind date that had started everything. I was not even meant to stay. Neither was I, he admitted. I arrived to stop someone else's evening. Instead, mine changed forever. We both smiled at the unlikely truth hidden inside those words. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a wrapped sketchbook. I bought something for you. Damien accepted the gift with visible surprise. Inside the cover I had drawn a quiet riverside scene. 2 empty benches faced the water beneath blooming trees. Across the bottom of the page I had written, "Every extraordinary story deserves one ordinary place where it can simply breathe." Damien looked at the illustration for a long time before carefully closing the book. No one has ever given me something they created themselves. Then keep it, I said. It belongs with you now. 1 year later, the children at the community center still argued about whether dragons preferred blue wings or green ones. Mrs. Harper continued delivering homemade cookies every Thursday. My illustrations eventually filled bookstore shelves across the country. Damien still worked longer hours than I thought anyone reasonably should, but he never missed the annual Children's Reading Festival. The students adored the quiet man who always volunteered to read stories and somehow remembered every child's name. To the rest of the city, Damien Moretti remained an influential businessman whose past inspired endless speculation. To me, he was simply the man who accidentally walked into the wrong restaurant for the right reason. Sometimes fate does not arrive with flowers after all. Sometimes it quietly changes seats, cancels a blind date, and allows 2 strangers to discover that the life they were searching for had been waiting in the wrong place all along.